All right, guys, today is a day that I'm very excited for. We are going to be going through every Fortnite POI that has ever existed, and we are going to be rating it from S tier being the best, the greatest. It's got all the loot. It's got all the action. You want to be landing here as many games as you can, all the way down to F tier, which is POIs that I probably never went to, and if I did end up there, it was probably an accident. Now, obviously, POIs have changed so much over the years. There's a lot to consider when it comes to rating them in terms of how special they are in my mind, how good was the loot, how easy were the rotations. There's so many things that we're going to get to talk about, and so many old nostalgic POIs we're going to get to go and relive, and I cannot wait. First POI we got to deal with off the bat is going to be Tomato Town, and honestly, I feel like this one's going to be a little bit biased from me, because Tomato Town, for people who watched my OG Fortnite content, you know this is where I always landed. When I was first introducing Lockie to Fortnite, we'd always come here, we'd loot up, we'd get some pretty average weapons, maybe get some materials from over at Weeping Woods. Like, to be honest, the amount of loot, not that great. The amount of materials, also not that great. And it's not even in the best position on the map. But just for pure nostalgic purposes, and the fact that it was just generally an all-round cool POI that actually did get a lot of action, I'm definitely going to be giving this one A tier. I do love it. It will always hold a special place in my heart, and I'm gonna give it the A. Next up, though, we got Anarchy Acres. Anarchy Acres was actually a pretty solid POI. I remember really early on, there were so many meme strats that you could do around in like the corn when the first time you were able to actually hide here. And then on top of all that, it's actually got a pretty solid amount of loot. The only reason I personally didn't love it was I found a lot of the building geometry kind of weird to navigate. They're not super easy to build inside of. Finding a lot of the chests could be really hard back in the day. I personally didn't land here a lot, but just because of the amount of loot, the amount of materials, and also the amount of memes that I've got to do there over the years, I'm definitely going to throw a B tier. Oh, all right. Next up, we've got an absolute classic. I feel like this is probably the most iconic POI on the original map, other than maybe Tilted Towers. It's Dusty Depot. The three big warehouses just sitting smack bang in the middle of the map. I'm kind of conflicted. Like, yeah, a lot of nostalgia around it. I did really genuinely like landing there quite a bit. I think it had maybe like 10 chests roughly between all three of the different warehouses, but it was a little bit awkward because you land there, there's no real way to get a lot of materials other than some of the pallets. And after that, you kind of a little bit stranded in the middle of this giant field. I'm gonna give Dusty Depot C tier. I feel like people aren't gonna like that, but there you go. All right, next up, we're gonna do Pleasant Park. Honestly, like an absolute all-time classic. You literally cannot hate this place. I feel like I don't even need to explain myself here. Pleasant Park is gonna be going straight up to S tier. No questions asked. We don't even need to vet it. It's got tons of loot. It's got tons of materials. It's got so many people dropping there, so the action is always absolutely popping. Pleasant Park, one of the few POIs that was just as good in the Chapter 1 map as it is in the Chapter 2 map. Still gets so many people dropping there, so much good loot. And I feel like if you're a gamer, if you're relatively confident, if you're someone who likes to have an action-packed round of Fortnite and doesn't like hiding till the final circle, Pleasant Park is just a place you cannot avoid. Now it's time to deal with Lonely Lodge. Now, Lonely Lodge, if you guys don't remember, was back in the Chapter 1 map, kind of situated in the woods a little bit further north. Honestly, not really my favorite POI. It actually had decent loot, and definitely the materials you could get there were kind of insane, but it was all the way out on the edge of the map, and there really wasn't that much action that you'd run into after you looted there, especially back in the day before there was, you know, like crazy ways you could rotate, like rifts and everything. Once you landed at Lonely Lodge, you'd pretty much just have a really cowardly, boring round all the way to the end. I never really dropped there. I'd sometimes end up there at the end of the game. I feel like this is maybe a little bit harsher than it deserves, but I'm going to drop down to E tier. Really not my favorite. Don't really want to go there again. Now, Sunny Steps was probably one of the coolest POIs I think that Epic added all the way back in Chapter 1. In terms of how it looked, like that place was one of the most standout, unique places on the Chapter 1 map. It actually had a really good amount of loot, and even though it was super out of the way, it got added at the same time as the volcano, meaning that you could rotate out using all the geysers around the volcano super easily. So honestly, even though I didn't land there a ton, it was a little bit awkward to loot just because of the geometry of all those pyramids. It was still a really, really strong place to land. Pretty good loot, pretty good materials, really easy rotation so you could get action right after. I'm still gonna put it only at B tier because I mean, it's just a bit of a weird POI all round, but definitely strong. Paradise Palms. Now, this is one that I feel like could be a little bit controversial. I know a lot of people who absolutely loved Paradise Palms, but I've always found the buildings in that POI were really kind of weird. Unlike places like Retail Row and Pleasant Park, where you've got proper walls and doors and things that actually give you cover, so many of the buildings in Paradise Palms were just super open. They had giant gaping holes in the walls, and half the time you'd be looting inside a building and you were just getting shot from every direction. And because of the way that builds work, you couldn't even put up a wall. So honestly, the loot in Paradise Palms was kind of hectic, but I always found it a little bit annoying to loot and also just super, super frustrating getting picked off all the time. On top of that, you're all the way on the edge of the map. It really means that once you've looted up there was always this weird dead zone because you had to walk all the way to Retail Row before you'd find a single other enemy. Definitely can't put it above B tier. It's only getting B tier because it has a lot of chests and a lot of action. Okay, Shifty Shafts. Now, Shifty Shafts was honestly a pretty unique POI. The idea of having those tunnels that go down under the ground, it's pretty rare that Epic will do a POI that has those like deep underground areas, and it was honestly a really, really cool one. On top of that, the way that people figured out you could like hide inside the rooftops, the amount that you'd be chasing people through there and couldn't figure out where they'd gone, it was kind of this really cool, different game of cat and mouse. Ultimately, it was never that busy. The loot wasn't that good, but at the end of the day, you could rotate pretty quickly through to Tilted Towers and then try and get some fights there. I'm probably gonna have to give it C tier though. I did like it. It was really cool. It was really unique. It's honestly a pretty standout POI of Fortnite Chapter 1 for me. But just because of how limited the loot was and how some of the building could be a little bit awkward, I can't put it too high. I'm trying to be balanced. All right, next up, we got another one that I actually reckon is going to be controversial again, and that is Lazy Links. I know a lot of people who really liked this POI. It had a couple of chests, a relatively decent number. There are a few trees lying around so you could get some materials, although not a ton. But I honestly never got why people liked Lazy Links so much. The golf carts were kind of cool, but other than that, it's right on the edge of the map. There isn't that much loot. You couldn't really get that many materials, and then you're just stranded in the middle of nowhere with no action, no materials, probably not that many good items. I'm giving it a D tier. Honestly, I know some people who would put that all the way up at the top, but for me, definitely not the case. Next up, we've got Salty Springs. Now, back in the OG Chapter 1 map, Salty Springs is without question S tier. It was right in the middle of the map. It was packed with people every single game. Like, you get 10 people dropping there almost every round. You get really good loot. It was surrounded by trees, so the materials were pretty solid as well. And most importantly, when you leave there, you're in the middle of the map. So there's so many places you can go fight. Also, the Spire mountain that was right next to Salty added in this sick element where you could drop up there and try and snipe down on people or knock people off the top of that spire when you're shooting back from Salty. Long story short, this POI had a lot going for it. It had loot, it had action, it had materials. Even though the Chapter 2 version of Salty, which keeps changing names like Bony Burbs and whatever else, isn't quite as good, the Chapter 1 was just so solid, it's got to go at S tier. I can't do it dirty like that. Next up, we're going to do Loot Lake. Now, this is honestly a pretty cool one to deal with because I feel pretty conflicted. On one hand, the amount of loot there was average. I think the main house in the middle had like 3 chests. Then there was like a couple on the actual island and in the cave down below. So 4 or 5 chests total. Technically, I guess you could include the factories on the shoreline as well and add a couple more. But the actual loot you would get at Loot Lake, ironically, not that good. I'm still gonna actually do it the favor of an A tier rating, similar to Tomato Town. It's just the nostalgia more than it is the actual quality of the POI. It's got a special place in my heart, and I've got to give it a good rating. Happy Hamlet. Now, you guys might remember, I'm pretty sure this got added in the Christmas update one year, and it was this beautiful little kind of like snow town out in the middle of nowhere. Now, a lot of the buildings that are in Happy Hamlet kind of give me a very similar vibe to Misty Meadows. In fact, the whole place does. But honestly, it was kind of, again, out in the middle of nowhere, really, really far off to the side of the map. The loot there was good, but once you got it, you did have to kind of hike all the way back in before you'd actually start finding more people. It's not a bad POI. Again, the loot is good. It had the forest right next to it with a bunch of materials. So the materials were good too. I just personally didn't like landing in the middle of nowhere. I never really went there. I'm gonna give it B tier because honestly, again, it was a relatively solid POI, but just personally, not for me. Didn't really enjoy it. Junction. Now, this is gonna be a pretty easy one to rate. Junction had pretty much no loot. It was all the way in the top corner of the map. It had a mountain you had to climb when you wanted to get out of it. Straight to F tier. Congratulations, Junction. You are our first F tier rating of the day. All right, we're blasting through all the chapter 1 map POIs here, but next up, I'm gonna deal with Wailing Woods, which honestly, I gotta give some pretty good points to, because even though, again, the loot wasn't that great in terms of the number of chests there, and even the chests that were there were pretty spread out, it was also kind of hard to find enemies because they're always hiding behind trees. But this place was the start of almost every single chapter 1 meme strategy. This was literally the logjam of chapter 1. You come here, you get max materials so quickly. You also had the base under the maze that appeared in some of the later seasons where we managed to do even more meme strats, trapping people underground, putting traps around the rift teleports that appeared. Long story short, even though the loot wasn't that good, and I probably only landed here when I was really trying to pull off some meme strats or just needed to get some materials later in the game, it was still such a great POI with some great nostalgia. Definitely gonna have to give it, I'm gonna give it A tier. I'm gonna give it A tier for, again, just the meme strat level material that it provided. Polar Peak up next. Polar Peak is, again, another one I feel really conflicted on, because realistically, this was kind of an annoying POI to deal with. You're up so high in the air that once you finish looting it, you could die pretty regularly trying to get off it, because people would try and shoot you down as you're going down the cliff, or they'd pick you off from the top, or honestly, you just straight up not really be able to find any enemies because you're so far away from them up in the sky. That said, this was one of the coolest, most unique chapter 1 POIs. You had the Infinity Blade that spawned up there, and don't get me wrong, it sucked when anyone else got it, but if you landed there and you managed to grab it first, you could absolutely destroy a lobby. On top of that, the actual tower that existed up there was literally built pretty much entirely to max height, so you could start some pretty ridiculous sky bases. You also got that whole narrative with the prisoner, the monster inside the peak. Honestly, again, loot, not that amazing. Material farming up there was also pretty rough, aside from getting stone. But with the narrative that existed around it, and just some of the cool, unique elements, I'm still gonna give it B tier, even though I personally didn't land there too often. Okay, Moisty Maya is up next, and Moisty Maya is, again, kind of a weird one to deal with. I think the material gain there was great, but it was all the way on one far corner of the map. I honestly didn't go there that often because it was just so annoying to get out of. On top of that, when you were walking through water back in chapter 1, you'd move super slowly. So other than going here for materials, I kind of didn't really like it. And if I wanted to get materials, I would just go to Wailing Woods. So Moisty Maya, I'm gonna chuck that all the way down at D tier, which I feel kind of bad about. Again, the nostalgia makes me want to give it a good rating, but I just can't. Time for another super easy one. Tilted Towers. You guys know there is only one place that Tilted Towers is going to go. It's going S tier. I remember when this dropped in the map, and every single game, you would have at least 15, 20 people going here. Tilted Towers kind of had everything. It was just the perfect place to fight people, especially back in those old seasons where cranking 90s wasn't as much of a thing. You had these amazing like shots going between buildings. The amount of loot was really good. The action there was absolutely insane. Whether or not you were rotating into it in the late game or you were dropping there for just some absolutely hectic action, Tilted Towers is pretty much without question one of the greatest POIs to ever exist, if not the greatest. You know that's going all the way up at S tier. I don't want to hear any other opinions on it. That is factually where it belongs. All right, now I feel like we may as well jump straight in and just immediately rate Tilted Town after that. Because Tilted Town, if you don't remember, was the Wild West variant of Tilted. Honestly, it was a cool idea by Epic putting this in Season X. The ability to come in there and get that really different loot, and I think it was no building inside Tilted Town as well, which made it like a pretty cool, unique experience. But it just didn't hit the same as the OG Tilted. There were some pretty awkward things that happened where people in like competitive games would be like ramping in build fights and then all of a sudden would just fall to their death because they hit the no build zone. It was a cool swing by Epic. I get what they were doing, but it was kind of more a swing and a miss, in my opinion. I'm chucking this at E tier, not because it was necessarily quite that bad, but because if you're putting Tilted in a POI's name, it's got a lot to live up to. And Tilted Town did not live up to it. Now, Neo Tilted, on the other hand, was a little bit better. If you don't remember, I believe it was season 9 when Neo Tilted got added. Very similar kind of layout and structure to Tilted Towers, but with that super futuristic theme. You also had the giant wind tunnels that went around the whole town, meaning you could rotate super easily and find enemies. I actually personally, as much as I loved using them to get elims, wasn't a huge fan of the wind tunnels because a lot of the time you'd be fighting someone, having a really good battle, and some dude would just come and third party you, or you'd be fighting someone, pretty much have them beaten, and then they would just jump in a wind tunnel and escape when there was nothing you could do. We're gonna chuck Neo Tilted at C tier. Again, probably independently could have been B tier, maybe even A tier. But you put Tilted in the name, it's got a lot to live up to. Neo Tilted, sort of did. Now, Pressure Plant was the POI where the giant mech robot got built, if you remember that. It had like a whole area where you would fly around within the kind of giant well where the robot was getting built. The loot there was solid, actually, like surprisingly good, kind of built on the remains of the volcano. And I definitely remember it had a lot of pallets, so there was a lot of really good kind of material you could get there as well. And then using the giant kind of like vents that made you float, you could actually rotate out and almost go halfway across the map in a single glide, which obviously meant looting up and then rotating out was a pretty easy and good combo to do. You could almost always get in the next zone. It wasn't that busy. Again, POIs that have ways that people can fly around can make it really annoying to pick people off because they can run away so easily. So I'm going to chuck it all the way down at, I guess, like D tier. Now, speaking of weird POIs, Lazy Lagoon is another one. I didn't really love it that much. All the cannons around Lazy Lagoon made it kind of fun to mess around with, and I definitely know I had some pretty fun meme games there. But realistically, you kind of had this very small town that didn't have that much loot. You had a ship that had really awkward kind of like building geometry, so you'd have some really kind of weird fights in there. Again, really cool POI, had some really unique stuff going on about it, but I'm gonna have to sit that one at C tier. Definitely no much higher. All right, we're almost near the end of our chapter 1 POIs here, but next up we got Dusty Divot. Now, honestly, Dusty Divot was a pretty hard one to rate for me because it changed so much over chapter 1. If you remember at the start of chapter 4, when the meteor first came in, it was literally like a barren wasteland. And I actually remember dropping there for my first ever games when it was created. And it was just this giant empty crater where there was no cover. There was nowhere you could really get builds. And you could either sit on top of the crater just picking people off because they couldn't really do anything to get away. Or if you were down there, it was just this absolutely chaotic mess, which, as bad as that was, it was kind of amazing at the same time. Now, over the seasons, trees started to grow. It really filled out. Dusty Divot became a pretty awesome place to land. You're in the center of the map. You had a pretty good amount of action. You've got relatively solid loot sitting in the middle. You've got the old loot that spawned up at the half-destroyed Dusty Divot buildings. And on top of that, you had like all the map's like narrative action happening around there. The giant meteor in Season X. Long story short, there was tons of really, really cool things that happened in Dusty Divot. Definitely not an S tier POI, but I'm actually going to give it that A tier. Center of the map, prime location, solid loot, good materials. there's a lot to love. Next up, we're gonna do the block, which is a super interesting one. If you don't remember, the block was this like big square POI where every week or every 2 weeks, Epic would literally pick a community created thing that someone had made in creative to go onto the block. Now the block, super hit or miss. Some weeks it had the dumbest amount of loot ever, like 1 million chests, and you could get max materials in like 3 seconds. Other weeks, it was awful. Like, it was a place that you didn't want to go, had very little loot, was super annoying to get materials, and honestly, just awful all around. But the idea of a place that the community creates being on the map and having entire POIs change every 2 weeks, I thought that was awesome. It was a super cool, super unique idea. Little bit hit or miss, but I'm actually going to chuck it up at A tier because the amount of good POIs that came out of that place and the amount of unique gameplay was honestly pretty damn solid. Flush Factory, honestly, relatively bad loot out in the middle of nowhere, but I remember doing our first ever trying to ramp out to Spawn Island videos there, and that does give it a couple of points for nostalgia. Unfortunately, though, the fact that it was isolated so far out to the side of the map means I pretty much never went there. I can't give it too high of a rating. We're going to be chucking it down at the old D tier. Now, Frosty Flights kind of had similar energy to Flush Factory. Again, on the corner of the map. The loot was pretty good here, but again, you're in this like icy landscape, so there wasn't that much ability to get materials. You could, however, grab a plane and get out of there pretty quick. That said, unless I was doing some kind of dumb meme strat with a plane, I never really liked landing here. So I think we're going to be chucking this one at D tier along with Flush Factory. Similar vibe to that is definitely our next one, Haunted Hills. Haunted Hills was that weird graveyard all the way out to the side of the map. Now, the only difference is Haunted Hills actually had a pretty good number of chest spawns. And if you wanted to play a pretty safe game and get a bunch of loot and then rotate through with a pretty good amount of materials as you're coming into zone, it actually wasn't as bad as a lot of people thought. That said, again, I would feel wrong if I put it above Frosty Flights, so we're going to chuck it down a D tier too. Now, Snobby Shores was similar to Haunted Hills in the sense that it was all the way out on that far side of the map, and it was the side of the map that was also a lot less used, but it did have a ton of loot. The amount of houses at Snobby Shores, it was almost like landing at like a retail row or a pleasant park. The only difference was less people and less action. So if you, again, wanted to search for a new item or just get a whole bunch of materials and loot before you actually started fighting people, Snobby Shores was a really solid place to drop. I'm gonna chuck it up at C tier. It was in the middle of nowhere. I personally didn't like it that much, but generally speaking, it was relatively good. All right, now next up, we've got Mega Mall, which is effectively, again, like the neo-tilted version of Retail Row. Had the slipstreams that went all around the POI. It did have a pretty good amount of loot there, and a lot of it actually stayed the same as the original Retail Row. The biggest change, obviously, was the mall, which actually just added in a whole ton of new loot. That said, again, the slipstreams mean it wasn't quite as good, and it was a little bit annoying getting third-partied. And on top of that, just it's not the original Retail Row, and for some reason that means I harbor some deep kind of, I don't know, resentment towards it because it took the classic Retail Row off the map. We're gonna be chucking it down though at C tier alongside Neo Tilted. That's definitely where it belongs. All right, next up, Greasy Grove, another chapter 1 POI I honestly never really went to. I'm pretty sure in my first ever Fortnite video though, there's actually footage of me landing here and showing how you can build and shoot on people, which was honestly kind of cringe when I go back and look at it, but definitely one of those OG POIs I used to land at when I was too scared to fight. That said, it is in the middle of nowhere. It was a little bit weird to loot. I rarely ever went here. I'm gonna have to give it D tier. There's not that much to say about our next one, Starry Suburbs. It was kind of just a little bit off to the side of Pleasant Park. Honestly, there was a lot to like about it. There was a point where loot would literally come flying out of the sky as a star. It had some pretty good chest spawns, but personally, just never vibed it. It was a little bit weird. It felt like a bit of a random POI that didn't even need to be there. This is probably too harsh. I'm going to give it E tier. And I believe our final Chapter 1 POI is going to be Tomato Temple, which wasn't as good as the original Tomato Town. Don't get me wrong. It had more loot. It had more materials. It was just generally bigger and better, but it's not the original Tomato Town. And therefore, I'm only going to be giving it a C tier because it just didn't hit the same. And now we're going to be shifting on to our big old Chapter 2 POIs. And you know what? I'm going to start off with one of my favorites, which is Lazy Lake. Lazy Lake is kind of gives me similar vibes to like the original Retail Row. It's not quite in the middle of the map, but it's pretty close. Gets a lot of people landing there, a lot of action, a lot of loot. It's got a lot of materials around it as well. I'm actually going to give Lazy Lake as one of my very few S tiers for the Chapter 2 map. It is still really, really solid. Now, next up, we're going to do Catty Corner. Catty Corner is one that I'm kind of conflicted about because there have been periods where it's actually been my main drop spot for the entire season, especially when Kit the boss was around and you would get the mythic charged shotgun as well as Kit's shockwave launcher there. This was such a good place to land and pretty much is the only place that I would land. But since then, obviously, you don't have any bosses there anymore. It is kind of out of the way. That said, it's still got a ton of loot, a ton of chests, pretty good materials as well. And normally you can find a pretty quick rotation to go from there, either in a car or with a launch pad, right into Lazy Lake if you want to get more action. I can't quite give it S tier, but definitely just because of the mythics that existed there, A tier has got to be good. Now, speaking of POIs with cool bosses, next up, let's do the Shark. Obviously, you had the Vault there, you also had the Scar, and you had the mythic grapple hook, all spawning in that one place. Now, I actually really hated going here. A, because you would die so quickly to the mythic Scar boss when you were trying to get it. On top of that, the geometry of the building made it really awkward to build in and also made it really easy to get snuck up on. And on top of all that, it was out on the edge of the map. That said, the feeling of getting in there, getting the grapple and running for your life was so good. But unfortunately, now the boss is gone, it is in the middle of nowhere. I would say this is the least used POI in the entire game. If you think people don't go to Coral Castle, the Shark is just an even worse version of Coral Castle these days. If it was the OG version with the mythic boss, I could see it being an A tier spot. But just because of how it is today, I'm actually going to give it an E tier rating. And the only reason it's not a hard F is that one season where we had the mythic boss there as well. Speaking of the Shark, though, it is time for my, again, very controversial opinion, which is Coral Castle. You guys are never going to predict where I'm putting this because Coral Castle was a very good POI. Now, I know a lot of you are already typing in the comments section about how I'm wrong and my opinion is bad, but hear me out. There were those statues that spawned down there of the fish that gave 110 brick each. You could get max materials at Coral Castle faster than you could get them even at Logjam. On top of that, it had like 15 to 20 chest spawns and a whole bunch of other really good loot. The only thing that sucked about Coral Castle was when it was initially being hyped, we all thought it was going to be this epic Atlantis-like POI, and it was kind of a letdown. And then on top of that, it's super out of the way. If there was a way that you could rotate out of Coral Castle and get to a busy part of the map even quicker, I would probably land here a lot more often. Unfortunately, it didn't have that, and the reason I rarely went there was that exact reason. That once you land at Coral Castle, it takes a long time to actually get in the fight and find people. That said, that loot and that material made it a pretty solid spot. I'm actually gonna give it B tier, and I am so ready for the hate that decision is gonna get. Stark Industries. Now, I remember at the start of this season, everyone thought the number of map changes was like weirdly little. Not that much was different, not that much was going on, and then all of a sudden, in like week 2 or week 3 of the season, bam, a giant block of island dropped out of the sky and landed on the map, changing it forever. I honestly loved that Stark Industries POI. The way that you had those giant cliffs coming off the side of it led to some really cool gameplay. You also had the Stark Mythic spawning there. The amount of loot was really good, and the amount of action that place got because of the vault, the mythic, and everything else, it was pretty hectic. The building layout was a little bit annoying to fight in, so I'm not gonna quite give it S tier, but honestly, Stark Industries is a solid A tier spot for me. We've got Believer Beach, which is a pretty huge POI in Fortnite Chapter 2. It hasn't really changed that much since the start. I mean, obviously it's been renamed and given a bit of an alien theme, but other than that, it's effectively still the same POI that we started with. I kind of like Believer Beach. It's got a whole lot of chests there. It does remind me a lot of Paradise Palms for obvious reasons. But generally speaking, you get good loot. You got a lot of vehicles that you can rotate out with once you land there. And I'm actually going to give this one a solid A tier rating. Definitely not S tier. Definitely not all the way up there with the best of the best, but definitely a pretty good place to go. Now let's do Bony Burbs, which obviously is this kind of like weird semi-salty, semi-tilted thing that they've been trying to do in Chapter 2, right in the middle of the map. It kind of feels like the not best parts of Salty Springs with the not best parts of Tilted Towers. I know they've been changing and renaming the POI over all the seasons, but it just doesn't hit the same for me. It does get a lot of points because it's in the middle of the map, which means you get a lot of action and easy rotations. It's also got a pretty solid amount of loot, but all the holes in the buildings, and the very fact that it's trying to imitate two of the greatest POIs without actually being the best POI, I don't know, man. I'm going to have to give that a solid C tier rating. And while we're at it, at the same time, Salty Towers, exact same rating because it's effectively the exact same POI. Next up, we've got our next epic POI, undoubtedly one of the best, one of the greatest, and honestly, I'm almost gonna say, in fact, I think I am gonna say, it is my favorite new POI in all of Fortnite Chapter 2, and it doesn't exist anymore. You guys know what I'm thinking of, the Grotto. Now, the feeling when you like snuck into the grotto and you're trying to break into the vault, you're trying to avoid guards, the way you would come down the shaft at the start when you're landing there, taking out Brutus, the mythic minigun was such a sick item to use, getting into the vault and trying to get out before you get ambushed and have all that loot stolen from you. Everything about the grotto was amazing. And on top of all that, normally my criticism would be it was out of the way, so you couldn't really get a bunch of action after landing there. But they even threw in a helicopter if it wasn't good enough already. Grotto, get up there, take your position in S tier POI, because that is where you belong. And if we're very, very lucky, one day Epic might even bring it back. All right, speaking of POIs with bosses and vaults that are definitely not S tier, we're going to be going with the Yacht. Now, the Yacht was obviously put in the game with Deadpool, and he was the kind of boss of this area. I know obviously we had the cat there sometimes as well, but I've always really thought of it as the Deadpool POI. Now, honestly, it was a really awkward place to loot. The kind of building was really weird. The fact you're on this weird geometry boat made it kind of awkward and you'd mess up all the time. The loot there, not that good. The mythic, especially the Deadpool pistols, I think without question the worst mythic that has ever been in the game. Long story short, it's in the middle of nowhere. The loot's not that good, kind of awkward to loot. I hated it. I almost never went there. As a definite F tier POI for me. And I don't say that lightly. I hated that place. Now we've got Colossal Coliseum. Now I actually dropped a decent amount here in Season 6 because it was not a bad place to go. The amount of loot you could get, the amount of chest spawns, if you landed in that middle area, you get armed up pretty quickly. The downside was not a whole ton of materials to be had. You had to really rotate kind of far before you'd be able to stock up, but it was kind of the middle of the map. You also had the Mandalorian sniper right nearby that you could get your hands on. There was a lot to like about Colossal Coliseum. Not amazing, definitely not amazing, but I'm going to give it a B tier POI rating. All right, next up, we've also got Colossal Crops, which again, kind of a meh POI in my opinion. All those farm ones I've always found a little bit annoying to loot. All the loot's very spread out. It's not condensed in one building. That said, when you get in like a UFO last season and fly over the top of it, it was actually kind of good because you could spot all the loot on the ground from the sky. And there's a lot of cool plays you can make in the corn. Definitely not a place I went that often though. So I think I'm actually going to put Colossal Crops at D tier. Same with Corny Crops. I feel like that also belongs at the same tier. Corny Crops complex, which is what we got last season, effectively was the same, but it just added that large underground base. And I hated it. It literally felt exactly like Corny Crops and Colossal Crops, but just more annoying because you were getting shot at by these bosses, and Dr. Sloan, when she splits in 3, had the ability to take you from 200 health to 0 in like 0.1 seconds. So I'm actually going to put Corny Complex at E tier. Hated it, never went there unless I was looking for a scanner or a railgun. Definitely not a POI I'm keen to go back to. All right, now let's do Dirty Docks. Dirty Docks is pretty far out and not really a place where many people go, but it's got a lot of chest spawns and then also is weirdly busy. I don't really know why people land here. They definitely do. Personally, not my favorite. I'm actually going to chuck it at C tier because I got to acknowledge the amount of loot that exists there. Definitely not my favorite place to go. Craggy Cliffs is up next, and Craggy gives me similar vibes. Again, all the way on the edge of the map. Pretty solid loot, but not really in the thick of it. Not that much action to be had, and you always have to drive for a long time after you leave it. So we're going to chuck that at C tier as well. And guys, I've just realized there is an OG Chapter 1 POI that I somehow forgot to rate in the previous part, which is Retail Row. How did I forget about Retail Row? Now, obviously, our rating here has got to reflect both the Chapter 1 and the Chapter 2 version. The Chapter 1 version is without question S tier. Now, even though the Chapter 2 version looks like basically the same POI, it's way more out in the middle of nowhere. It doesn't get as much traffic as it used to. So I feel like I'd put the Chapter 2 one at more like B tier. So because of that, we're going to even it out. We're going to cut the difference. It's an A tier POI. Chapter 1 would definitely be S tier. Unfortunately, though, just with how dead it is these days and how it is kind of out in the sticks, I don't know, not really my favorite place to go anymore. We're going to do Holly Hedges next. Honestly, solid POI, pretty good materials you can get from all the fences and all the hedges around it. It's got a decent number of chests, not a super busy place to go, but you can't deny that it's got a lot going for it. We're going to put that one at C tier. It's kind of like an average place. I'm not angry if I land there, but I'm also not super happy at the same time. Now, after Holly Hedges, we're going to have to do the Season 7 variant, Holly Hatchery, and I hated it. The idea of the cubes and those zones where you could fly around and build in the air was kind of cool, but it made it so awkward and so painful to loot that once it turned into Holly Hatchery, I almost never went there. The loot was still decent, and you know, the whole idea of those alien zones was interesting, so I'll give it E instead of F, but it was definitely my least favorite POI in Season 7. Now, coming in with another solid POI this season, let's do Misty Meadows. Misty Meadows, I weirdly don't hate, which I know sounds super weird because it's kind of in the same area in terms of distance away from all the action on the map as Happy Hamlet. It is kind of a similar vibe, like I said before, to Happy Hamlet. It's towards the edge of the map. It's got similar kind of geography and buildings to Happy Hamlet. It's a little bit weird to loot, but at the same time, I find that just because of how close it is to Lazy Lake, you can land here, get some pretty good loot, and immediately get back in the action. So even though it's definitely not my favorite place to drop, I think it definitely deserves a B tier rating. All right, next up we got Slurpee Swamp, and honestly, who doesn't love Slurpee Swamp? You got basically free unlimited shields. You got pretty good chest spawns. On top of all that, there's also pallets lying around. It's one of the best places in the game to get metal. It's got a solid number of chests. The building geometry is kind of weird. Like, people can really drop on you and ambush you and you can get caught out a lot. But just for free shields, free heals, and a whole bunch of memes over the years of fishing and sitting, healing ourselves inside Storm, I'm gonna have to give it A tier. Definitely not up there with the all-time greats, but definitely pretty solid. Speaking of other solid POIs that weirdly, I started off hating this one and then I ended up coming to love it, which was the Spire. That giant tower in the center of the map that was added when we got the Fortnite Wild season. Now, looting all those lower tiers, I found it to be kind of awkward, and the boss could be kind of terrifying. But once you actually managed to get loot, if you made your way to the top of the Spire, sitting up there with a bow, just picking people off, and then using, if you had a shockwave variant, the shockwave version of the bow to launch off the Spire to finish people off and absolutely ambush them from the sky, that was some of my favorite stuff to do while it was in the game. And I reckon I went to the Spire and sat on top with a bow probably like at least 50% of my games. I can't give this any less than an A tier rating. All right, we're going to do Stealthy Stronghold now. And honestly, I'm probably going to rate this pretty bad. I feel kind of weird about it because obviously there's so many trees, so the materials are really, really good, but it is really isolated off to the side of the map. A lot of the chest spawns are super spread out, so it takes a while to actually get through and loot it. And then even then, you've got to kind of make your way around those giant walls when you want to leave. And on top of all that, if there is another enemy there, it's so easy for them to sneak up and ambush you because you just can't see anything through all the trees. I feel like this could be a bit harsh, but Stealthy Stronghold, I never go there. I never want to go there, and it's going to be a D tier. All right, next up, we're going to be rating kind of at the same time the Agency and the Authority, which are obviously the two versions of the Agency building that we got in Season 2. I honestly kind of love this POI. This was like the main way we were introduced to the idea of the vault. I used to come here a lot, and once you understood how to loot it and how to navigate the building, it was pretty fun to play around. Also, again, it was in the center of the map, so it got a ton of action. You also had the Midas Mythic spawning in here. I'm not going to give it an S tier rating, but the Agency is definitely going to be sitting up at A tier for me. Now, what's not going to be sitting up at A tier is going to be the Ruins. Now, this was basically the destroyed version of the Agency. And I gotta be honest, it kind of sucked. You get ambushed by ghosts all the time. You had the new like ghost version of the Midas Mythic, which wasn't nearly as good. The building was destroyed, which meant you didn't have cover like before. I'm actually gonna put this all the way down at E tier because once it turned into the Ruins, I almost never wanted to go there. It just lost that charm that it used to have. All right, Steamy Stacks is going to be our next one. Again, kind of conflicted. I barely ever go here. It's in the middle of nowhere. The loot's pretty solid, and the fact that you can fly out of the stacks means you can rotate towards the action pretty quickly, meaning that it being in the middle of nowhere isn't the biggest issue. But honestly, not my favorite POI. Don't go here that often. We're going to have that one sitting at C tier. I feel like that's a pretty fair rating. All right, and now the final POI that we're going to tackle is the rig, which is kind of a bit of a weird one. It really did sit out in the middle of nowhere, but this is where you got the boom bow, if you remember. And on top of that, it was just another one of those great Agency-like POIs where you'd sneak in, try to get the vault card, have to avoid people ambushing you. The mythic that you got here was pretty solid, and after all that, it did again have the helicopter that you could rotate out with. Now, the rig really was only in the game while it existed as this cool POI with the mythic and the vault. It didn't, unlike the shark, then stay in the game and kind of lose that kind of luster and shine that I remember it with. So the rig, I'm going to give it a solid A tier rating. I love the boom bow. I loved building sky bases, sniping people off the top and absolutely ruining their day because that item was completely broken. And honestly, just all around a pretty fun POI. But guys, there you have it. That is my tier list ranking of the Fortnite drop spots. Let me know down in the comments below which ones you agree with, if there's any that you really didn't agree with. I'm expecting to get a lot of people angry about Coral Castle. As always, guys, if you want to enjoy the video, let me know with a like down below. It really helps me out. Use code MUSIC in the Fortnite item shop if you want to support the channel. And as always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you legends in the next one. Bye-bye.